Hey everyone, welcome back to the Them Before Us podcast. I'm your host, Jen Friesen, and today we are joined by someone who has actually shared his story with us on thembeforeus.com, Bobby Lopez. Hi, Bobby. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm excited to be on. I have not done one of these in a very long time, so I might be a little bit rusty.
Yeah, I know you've been a little more active in sort of public life and writing and sharing, and now you got family and
Yeah.
you've got other things going on, and so we really
Hmm.
appreciate you taking some time to help
Yeah.
inform our audience for sure. One of the things Them Before Us is unique in is that we want to help tell the stories of kids, though now adults, that have been impacted by some of the things our culture has said,
Hmm.
hey, this doesn't really matter. If we kind of switch dad and mom in and out,
Right.
or divorce, or same-sex parenting, or whatever it is, kids don't really
Hmm.
care. Love makes a family. And, a lot of our stories are just people sharing, hey,
Hmm.
it did impact me. Here's some negative ways it impacted me. Maybe here's some positive things, or resilience of the folks who've shared, of course,
Yeah.
is a part of what we want people to share. But that was a reason you got in
Hmm.
contact with Katie a long time ago and were willing to share your story with us. So yeah, as much as you'd love to, maybe just start out and share, kind of who was in your life as early as you can remember, and kind of walk us through your early
Well,
years.
I mean, I was a child of divorce. That was really kind of the central thing. I think since I came out with my story, would have been 14 years ago now. A lot of conversations with my brothers and sisters. You can have complicated my memories of everything, because for a lot of them they didn't really have the same memories that I did, and I had to deal with that, and I had to kind of figure out where I was wrong and where they might have been wrong about it. But my parents were essentially divorced really before I was born. I mean, they didn't actually legally get divorced until I was 8 or 9 or something like that, but they were separated, and they were both in relationships with other women by the time I was old enough to be aware of the world around me. So the world that I grew up in was one where, I had two parents that lived in separate places. I was living with my mom. She had a lot of health issues, and I think that she had a lot of struggles in her life, and there was just a lot of burdens on her, and I was kind of like an added burden. So it was hard. I think that she was a loving mother, but she definitely, I felt like there was a lack of connection with her. And so I kind of gravitated more towards the woman that she was in a relationship with. So my mother's partner was really my main
Mm,
parental
yeah.
figure. She was racially totally different from me, because my dad is Asian, my mom is Hispanic, and the partner was white. So it was, there were a lot of things about it that were alienating and kind of hard to process as a kid. My dad, I was very distant from. I just didn't have a close relationship with him. He was very involved with a series of women. Definitely when I was a child, he was mostly involved with one particular woman who he actually got back together with many years later. So he's with her again. Like they were an item in the 1970s, and now they got back together, I think, like 3 or 4 years ago. So it's kind of this funny thing where they were not together for 30 years, then they got back together. But during those 30 years, he was involved with different women, and so I didn't really feel like I could compete with my brothers and sisters and these other women and their kids, because a lot of them had kids. So that was how I was growing up.
How much time would you say you spent at your dad's house versus your mom's house
Oh, I
on a
mean, I
given like
probably
week or
went
month or
to my
whatever?
dad's house maybe once a month. I really did not see him. Yeah, I did not really
Okay.
have a relationship with him. When I was there, typically, from what I remember, I mean, I didn't really speak to him. He was usually busy doing other things, and I was usually just in some other room. It was very much like a pro forma thing. We didn't do it. It was mostly because my mom needed a break. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, and like we want to be really intentional at Them Before Us that we're not condemning adults that
Mhm.
desire to partner with the other, with same sex. It's not against our take on same sex parenting is not that a person who's attracted to someone of the same gender is like particularly evil and wrong. And you're saying your mom just had struggles. It's
Yeah.
hard to be a single parent. It's hard to have to
Yeah.
get divorced and be
Yeah.
splitting time. And there's lots of dynamics, right? And it's interesting you're sharing that, you did feel a connection to your mom's partner. So we're not saying that two women can't be good parental figures. They can
Mhm.
be good mother figures to you. But you are still kind of, it sounds
Mhm.
like, split between I still desire connection with my dad and he's sort of distant and he's
Yeah.
focused on other relationships. And then my mom's struggling. So she doesn't really have time for me either. So there's another caring adult around, but it's not your mom or your
Right.
dad. It sounds like.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I kind of evolved, and I'm not really active in the social conservative movement so much anymore because I got really caught up in the heat of it, and it was really at the time of Obergefell, and 10 years ago we published this book. Katie was part of it. I was part of it. We a whole bunch of us called Jephthah's Daughters, and it was really kind of dissecting all of the different angles of same sex relationships. And then, because of the fact that I got canceled over this, all of a sudden I was confronted with a lot of struggles that weren't real to me before, but that were real to me. And that I realized how hard my mother had it. I lost jobs. I still had all of the pressure on me of being married and having two kids, didn't have health insurance. It was really hard to stay in our house. And so I look back at my life and my mother's life, and yeah, I think that the same sex relationship thing, it was part of it. And I definitely still stand by my views that I think um, if you can build homes where there's a mom and a dad and they have a relationship with each other and an exclusive relationship with each other, that's better for the kids. But I think that a lot of these other economic issues were also a big part of it. My parents they were living in a time, particularly my mother, where racial discrimination was very, very severe. She had a very thick accent. She was a doctor, so it wasn't like she was poor, but it's not like she was raking in the kind of money that you think of when you think of a doctor. She was really struggling to provide for our kids. And her partner had made a much lower income. And as my mom got sick, her partner had to move in and take care of her. And the struggle with the healthcare and all of that really kind of overshadows in my mind what that is. And I didn't really realize that until I went through the cancel, being canceled, because basically I got canceled by a left-wing university, and then I got canceled by a conservative Baptist seminary. And I just was abandoned kind of by both sides. So I realized, wow, this is what it's like when nobody really is in your camp except for a handful of people, and you have to pay the bills. And as the father of the house, I can't just break down and, curl up in a ball and start crying. That's just not something that's acceptable for fathers in this society. So I got sick because of all the stress. And so I realized how bad the healthcare was. But at the core of it, the culture of divorce really is what produced the same-sex parenting scenario. That was almost when Katie and I were going and we were looking and talking to all of these different adults who had grown up in same-sex parenting situations. All of them had the same story. It was a divorce. And it's this, there's this younger generation of people who came from sperm banking or from adoption, and they kind of would clash with us sometimes when we would have this debate, because they would feel like we weren't really authentically children of gay parents, because obviously our parents were involved in heterosexual relationships. That's where we came from. And we grew up in a time, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. That was a time when the gay community did not want to acknowledge us. They didn't want to talk about gay couples raising children. That was an embarrassment. It was a shame, because it showed that a lot of people had gotten involved in relationships and then broken up. And I think that in the 70s and 80s, there was just a much more immediate reaction when you would tell people, yeah, my mom, my dad broke up and they got involved with same sex, people would immediately think, oh my gosh, that must have been so hard. The confusion, the disruption, all of that being dragged back and forth. I think the younger generation of people who were raised with gay parents, they just haven't grown up with that being the reaction that people have. The first reaction people have now is, wow, that must have been really cool, because it's like so innovative. And, and I think that's what so much of the work of Jephthah's daughter was it was trying to just give a voice to what the experience really was. It was really hard. And I think it's gotten better, but 10 years ago, 12 years ago, you could not talk about these things. You couldn't admit that it was hard, because everybody attacked you. And I still think that the LGBT community really mishandled that whole debate, because I think they're the only community I can think of that actively went against their own children. I mean, they really went after me, Brittany, who wrote with me, Denise, all of us, and it's hard to think about that. But I think the landscape has changed, and so I still stand by what I did, but I think other issues are so much more important for keeping families strong.
Oh yeah. Well, and we talk about it then before us. The first redefinition of marriage was no fault divorce. It was saying you don't need and that was a Republican president, or he wasn't president yet, but I think governor of California, Ronald Reagan, is the one, I think, kind of to justify that he wanted to get divorced. And it was this idea that marriage doesn't
Mhm.
need to be permanent and there can be other, because we believe there are legitimate reasons to get divorced, abuse, abandonment, adultery, these kinds of things. If one of the partners doesn't want to do it,
Mhm.
you can't stay married in a lot of ways. Is kind of an organizational view. I know the Catholics have a different view of that, but yeah, so no fault divorce started the issues, not people who identified as gay. And to your point, a lot of folks who, so your mom, I don't know what her family structure looked like, but a lot of people are coming out of divorced homes where you didn't see a good picture of masculinity and femininity and how those complemented each other and worked together. And so folks are looking for something different when they're entering into
Mhm.
romantic relationships. Can you talk a little bit about what was it like for you? So you're a man and you're maybe primarily kind of spending time with your mom and your mom's partner,
Mhm.
and there's all the issues that are swimming around, and you're hitting puberty and maybe you're thinking about dating. Like what was it like for you in terms of just identity of like being a man? How do I relate to women? What were things like with that?
I was a sickly child. My mother was sick, during a lot of it. She died when I was a teenager. I was abused, to be frank with you, starting at the age of 13. And it wasn't my mom, but it happened while I was living in her house. And I threw myself into that world, the gay world, to kind of try to cope with all of that. I think the identity was very hard. It was very hard to um, figure out who I was. It was very, very painful. And one of the things that I think men have to struggle with is when you come out of an experience like that, the society is just not very sympathetic to men who have mental health issues. They don't really want to give you leeway or help, or they instead they feel like they revert to tough love, and they like letting you learn lessons by consequences. And so that definitely happened to me. It took me a long time to realize that it's like, okay, the society is looking at me as a male. So I grew up around a lot of women because I had sisters and then aunts that were living in the house, cousins that were living in the house. So like there was just a lot of women around. And it took a while for me to realize that, just the reality is that society is not going to react to you as a man by saying, "Oh, you're hurt. Oh, that's why you did this strange thing. Let me kind of give you an ear and listen." That's just people don't care. They really really don't care. I remember when I first came forward and told my story, I was not trying to be aggressive or confrontational with the community at all. In fact, I kind of very much identified with it. But I mean, people were just so savage. And I remember trying to engage with some of these people and being like, it was hard. I mean, the mental toll it took on me just from the abuse alone, and then with everything else added on top of it, and being in that environment where I think if you are a male and you experience abuse like that, the tendency of people is to give your abuser the right to define you. They don't say, "Oh, you were a victim of abuse." They say, "Whatever you're experiencing, that's a reflection of who you really are," and the abuser must have noticed that. That was kind of the underlying response to people to that story during that early period. And I just remember people out there in the public, you know, just they were like, "Well, why don't you just go kill yourself?" They were just very savage and brutal. But I think that's partly I had to realize that that's just kind of what life is like when you're a man. I think I didn't realize that for a very long time. I kind of expected the world to react to me the way they reacted to my mother, her partner, my sisters, and everything like that, which is, "Oh, you're hurting. Let me, let's, why don't you talk to someone," and stuff like that. So, or try to give you comfort. So,
Well, and we talk about the gender difference, the way it's supposed to be done. Yes, men and dads are supposed to challenge and push, but it's supposed to be age appropriate. It's supposed to be it's not that you go physically hurt or do other kinds of abuse to like toughen up kids. That's not the right way to go about it. So a healthy situation would have a male and a female complement to those things. There's dad pushing, but there's mom that comforts, that tempers dad, right? They're tempering each other. And when we have two of the same gender, you probably got an amplified
yeah,
version
yeah,
of empathy and comfort, and it's all going to be okay without the balance. But there's kids now being raised by two men, and so what's that going to look like? Is it going to be all tough love, all pushing, all challenge,
mhm,
and no comfort or empathy? So it was designed to be a balance, and you deserve that, and we're not getting that. But that's a really interesting perspective too, that you're saying even people outside of your home and that mom dad dynamic are still looking at you as like, well, you're a man, therefore you should have to act or deal with the hard things in your life in this certain way. And not people, I think maybe people don't have or haven't had language to help support kids who were raised in same-sex parenting homes.
there were all of these really shallow platitudes that went back and forth that didn't really address all the complexities of it. But I also think that part of it is um, I realized that um, my mother's struggles there were a lot of things. She came out of poverty. Came from a very, very poor background in Puerto Rico, and uh, it was the world that she was thrown into because she was very bright and she was very, very intelligent, and so they catapulted her into this. She got a scholarship to become a doctor, and all that, and she wasn't really ready for all that. And so this other part of her life that she was struggling with, she didn't have time or space to think about all that. She was just trying to throw everything together. And she started having kids kind of early on. I'm the youngest of four. And then there are other, half whatever step kids, that are related to us through the intervening marriages and stuff like that. So there were a lot of kids around. So it's very hard. I guess that's why now I really try to focus on family politics in a way that kind of bridges the left and the right, because I think that the right definitely, they understand the importance of just the Christian home where mother and father, a man shall leave his parents and cleave to his wife and then have a family. Like, you need that stability, you need that. That's how we evolved as people. That's the right really gets that, the importance of just putting the family first over your own desires. And then the left understands the whole thing that it's like you can't have stable families if workers don't have livable wages, and if like the situation that I was in after I lost all of my jobs and I was totally out there could not get any kind of assistance from Texas. So, I mean, I just was literally, my wife was a stay-at-home wife. So we had no income coming in. My family was very alienated for me, my biological family. So, I realized when you're in that situation to try to get health care for your kids, to be able to keep your car upkeep and then keep a roof over your head as prices are going up. And you saw during COVID how, like, all of a sudden everyone, they had to rely on their family. It wasn't a choice. You know what I mean? So I think that to try to rebuild the family and to get them before us, the psychology of it in the right place, I try to, I try to involve myself in political activism that respects both sides of that, whereas I think 10 years ago, I just thought of myself as a conservative because I didn't really get what the Democrats were talking about. I was like, well, I have healthcare. So what are people complaining about? I have this, that, and the other thing, but then you see it and you're like, oh, okay. So I think a lot of these marriages, it is really hard when there's all that pressure on you, when the social fabric has come apart, and there's not the expectation that you're going to stay during hard times. But then on top of it, times are harder. You can't move out of your house at the age of 18 and buy a house today. That's not going to, you can't get an apartment. You can't build a life. It's really hard. People are not having kids. They're not getting married. Their student loan debts are drowning them. So I think that to address all of it at once is the most important thing and the best way that I can honor my mother. Because I understand that her same-sex relationship was a complication for me, but I think, I also want to honor all the other things that she was dealing with and that people were dealing with. Yeah. And I think the LGBT, yeah, I think the LGBT community, the community and the movement are two different things. So I think the movement made a lot of mistakes. I think that they have done a lot of damage to the Democratic Party because they took all of this political attention to these really boutique issues that they cared about, like banning reparative therapy or, trans rights and things like that, that were so specific and that most people couldn't agree with, right? Um, but I think the community has evolved where now I don't feel this immediate clash when I talk to someone in the LGBT community. I feel like tempers have kind of cooled. And I think that's one good thing about the work that we did.
I think it's a really good, healthy perspective too for just you as a son. I mean, this
Mm,
happens, I think, to most of us when we become adults. You
mhm,
have a perspective of your parents now, and you start to see, like, oh, they had to work a job and pay taxes and
yeah,
take care of me and figure it out. And in light of medical challenges and all these things, that our parents are often trying to do the best they can. And that is, it seems like that's a protective feature from us getting bitter or hating them for something, versus being able to see your mom, like, she's a flawed person but
yeah.
loved you and was doing her best in some ways and made mistakes in other ways. How would you, just kind of for a final thought for our listeners, how did you get from the struggles you had in childhood and those issues with identity and those sorts of things to now married to a woman with kids and functioning as a member of society, and you've had challenges with your professional work and stuff, you said, but you were able to, I guess, when we think about society, you were able then to sort of hit those markers of, well, I want something different
Mhm.
for my life and for my kids'
Well, I
life.
mean, my faith was always really important. The church has always been my anchor. When I have been in a good church like I am in now, things go well. Other than that, I think the most important thing was I just looked at the life that I had up until that point, and I didn't want that same life for I didn't want my kids to grow up like that. So that was the main thing. Like I knew that I was going to have kids. I just always had that feeling that I was going to have kids, and I didn't want them to have to grow up the way that I grew up. It's that simple. So everything I did, I was like, okay, I'm sounding like the adults that were around me when I was a kid. So let me just stop and not try not to be like that. So,
That's awesome. I mean, you really are the picture of sort of that the them before us ideal is that, adults have to do hard things. Like you're saying, hey, I'm
mhm,
struggling and I have all this stuff in my past, but oh, I'm recognizing I sound like what the excuses that maybe some adults were making. So I'm going to make
yeah,
different choices going forward. That's awesome. I don't know if you've ever read Brad Wilcox's book
mhm,
called Get Married, but he talks about, the
mhm,
people whose marriages are lasting. One of those groups is the people who's had parents whose marriage didn't last and they decide I'm doing something different and their marriages work, so it's really encouraging.
I'm glad we got a chance to speak, and I hope you guys continue to thrive and do well. So stay in touch.
Yeah, thanks. We appreciate you sharing your story so much. Wish
Thank
you
you.
the best.